Hello and welcome from Brussels, where European leaders have told Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, that she needs to be clearer about what she needs to sell her Brexit deal to MPs at Westminster. They warn the Prime Minister again that there is no chance whatsoever of any renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement. Diplomatic sources here have described the Prime Minister's appeal last night as vague, and an EU draft conclusion offering to look at further assurances on the Irish backstop issue was cut out of the final text. So these are the main developments. Well, at a news conference, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, accused Mrs May of being nebulous and imprecise in her demands for a concession on the Irish backstop. Now, reports say that Britain was seeking a target to end the backstop a year after it was introduced. The proposals supported by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her Austrian counterpart Sebastian Kurz, but was rejected by several other leaders. Theresa May has again warned that her Brexit deal is at risk if the concerns of members of Parliament at Westminster are not addressed. And the EU leaders have continued their discussions this morning, and the cameras caught what appeared to be a slightly heated exchange perhaps between Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker. She is still under pressure, of course, from her own backbenchers to tell Europeans to compromise over the backstop, and she may not have been too pleased with what Mr Juncker had to say about her being unclear when he was talking at that press conference last night. So some people on social media certainly thought that was a rather animated exchange. Well, we've also been hearing from Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, when he arrived here this morning, with his thoughts on the British presentation.
Very satisfied with the conclusions that we reached last night, which are that we as the European Union stand by the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated. We don't believe it's up for renegotiation. We're very keen to begin, as soon as it's ratified, talks on the future relationship, because we want to have a close future relationship with the United Kingdom. As Europe, we reaffirmed our commitment to the need for a backstop, not just because it protects Ireland and ensures that there's no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, thus protecting the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement, but also because it's a European issue too, and an open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland can't become a backdoor to the single market, and that's why European countries also very strongly support the backstop, not just an Irish issue, very much a European issue as well. And by resolving it in the withdrawal agreement, we can make sure that no side uses the threat of a border in Ireland as part of leverage in the future relationship talks. So really it's there for three reasons, not just an Irish issue, very much a European issue as well. And also agreed to step up any preparations that we're making for the unlikely event of a no-deal scenario. So happy with the conclusions, and very much a case of, in the European Union, it being one for all and all for one.
So that was Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister. The Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, he's also been talking and saying that the European Union is ready to give assurances to Britain over the withdrawal agreement.
The European Union, and that was no surprise for Theresa May, made once again clear that we will not open the withdrawal agreement again. But of course we have a strong interest to make clear how the future relationship should be, and also what the backstop means. And the backstop is an idea for a short period of time and not for the next decades. And I think it was necessary to say this clearly from the European Union, so that the UK can trust us on this.
So that was the Austrian Chancellor. Back at home, the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington has been defending Theresa May's handling of these talks here in Brussels and saying that they are at least a welcome first step.
The Prime Minister is going to continue to seek the assurances that Parliament has, members of many parties have been asking for. That work's going to continue over the days to come, and then she will bring the deal back, and we'll continue that debate and have the vote.
David Lidington there. Let's talk to Chris Morris of our Reality Check team to find out a little bit more about exactly what was said last night. And it was fascinating press conference with Jean-Claude Juncker in particular, accusing the British Prime Minister of not being clear, of being nebulous and imprecise. Just tell us a bit more about what the EU27 are really saying.
Well, the statement they issued last night really had no surprises in it, in that individual leaders have been saying similar things for days, and most clearly no renegotiation of the withdrawal agreement. That of course includes the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland and the backstop. There were also the assurances we've already heard from individual leaders that this is only supposed to be a temporary solution if it ever were to come into effect, that it's a last-ditch insurance policy, if you like. But I think the idea that Theresa May was going to come away from here with some sort of legal guarantee which might stand opposed to what's supposed to be the legally binding text of the withdrawal agreement itself, that was never going to happen. And what we're once again, I think, faced with the problem that the most people here can ever offer is almost certain to be less than the least that some of her rebellious backbenchers are prepared to accept.
Do you sense a bit of an air of frustration among the other EU countries, the other EU leaders here with the British Prime Minister, with Theresa May?
I think there's a sense of frustration at the British political system and the deadlock they see in Westminster. And you mentioned the remarks made by Jean-Claude Juncker, in which he said it's not clear what the UK wants. And I think other politicians have said we're not talking really so much about the Prime Minister herself, we're talking about the entire gridlock in Westminster. More than 2 years after the referendum, we still don't know how the UK wants to play this, and I think that's a problem. But there were other things I think that the Prime Minister suggested in her discussions with the other leaders last night, which were the cause of some bemusement. There was a suggestion diplomats say, for example, that the non-binding political declaration about future relations might suddenly be put into the withdrawal agreement as a protocol of some kind, so it would become legally binding text. Now, the text of that agreement is so vague and so aspirational, I think it was a cause of some surprise that suddenly you'd want to add that to the withdrawal agreement at the last minute, again as some sort of potential sop to people back at home.
What happens next, Chris? I know it's not an easy question, it's never an easy question with Brexit, but we know there's not going to be a Commons vote now until January. This is winding down now, this EU summit, so where do we go next?
Well, I don't think this is the end of the road in terms of looking for clarifications and assurances. I think discussions will continue. Whether Theresa May will get anything markedly different than what she has already is open to question, but what the government has said is that there will be a vote in the House of Commons as soon as possible in January, certainly before January the 21st. At the moment, you have to say the numbers still don't look good if she can't get much more than is on offer here. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the other thing we heard from the EU last night is that preparations for no deal are still being accelerated. And next week on December the 19th, we're going to see a whole new raft of EU proposals for how they might deal with the prospect of the UK leaving next March with no deal at all. OK,
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Chris Morris there from our Reality Check team. Just to give you a flavour of how Theresa May really hasn't got very much of what she wanted here, and she did admit when she arrived here that she had low expectations. She said she wasn't expecting an immediate breakthrough, and she certainly didn't get any kind of immediate breakthrough. But in the draft text for the conclusions of this summit, which bizarrely we are shown, or we get to see before the summit's even started, but in those draft conclusions there was one paragraph saying that the EU is ready to examine whether any further assurances can be provided on the Irish backstop issue. And that is one of the things Theresa May was looking for, more reassurances on the backstop. Now, in the end, that was cut out of the final communique, of the final text. So even that sort of vague words about more reassurances being looked at, that was cut out, we gather, at the request of the Irish diplomats here. So she didn't even get some warm words like that. Well, let's talk to Paddy Smith, who's Europe editor at the Irish Times. Couldn't the least of a letter have those few words of reassurance about the backstop?
I think that you have to understand that what they didn't say, we will not give you more assurances. They simply said that we're not prepared to do it on this basis. And so that issue is still very much open. What you've got here is a bunch of seasoned politicians who understand very well the dynamics of parliamentary debates and the like. And they're in a situation where they knew perfectly well that if they said, yes, we'll give you the legal assurance that you want, Mrs May would have gone back to the Commons would have said, that's fine, we'll bank that, please get us some more, that's not enough. And the politicians here said, look, we're not going to be trapped into that kind of a situation. You have to come to us with clarity about what your Commons will accept. Now that is difficult for Mrs May, but that is what she's got to do. Previous
but isn't clarity on that, isn't that around the backstop? Isn't that, if she could get some clarity from the EU on the backstop, or some concessions, maybe that would get it through Parliament. Surely they understand that here.
Yes, I mean it's very problematic. It's not on the backstop; it's on the withdrawal mechanism from the backstop, and that's an important distinction. But you've got to understand that she's not going to come back here to leaders without a pretty solemn assurance that what she's bringing will be passed by the Council. And just think back to previous protocols and declarations that were agreed after treaties fell foul of individual member states. And in each case, and most recently Rutte, who in the Dutch Parliament, came back to the leaders and said, look, if you give me these words, my Parliament have given me the nod, and they will approve it. That's what she's got to do.
And just very briefly, how disappointed do you think she will be? Would she have been better off coming here, having put it to a vote in Parliament and losing that vote? Would that have helped her cause here?
I don't think so. I think it's that wouldn't solve the problem that we're addressing here. That they're not going to buy a pig in a poke. They're not going to buy some potential solution from her, and they expect her to do it.
And are they asking her to talk to people in Parliament?
I think that's what they're doing, and certainly the Danish Prime Minister and Mr. Rutte last night, leaving the meeting, were saying, look, it is a question of squaring your Parliament before you ask us to do it, and you have to come up with the solution. OK,
thank you so much for being with us. Paddy Smith, Europe editor of the Irish Times. Very good to talk to you. Let's just show you again, there's rather extraordinary pictures of Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker a short time ago having a rather animated discussion there. There's a lot of speculation that she's not happy with what he was saying at that news conference yesterday, when he was saying that her presentation was not clear, was imprecise, was vague, was nebulous. But who knows? That is it from me here in Brussels. You're watching BBC News.
Ben, thank you very much. Let's take a look now at the day's other main news. And the Christmas market in Strasbourg, the scene of Tuesday's attack in which 3 people were killed, has been reopened. The French Interior Minister attended the reopening amid heavy security. The attacker, 29-year-old Cherif Chichat, has been tracked down and killed by police. He'd been on the run for days. Our Europe reporter Gavin Lee has been to the scene in Strasbourg this morning, where the chase came to an end.
Well, this is the door of 74 Rue de Lazaret in Neudorf, and you can see this is the place where the suspect of the Strasbourg Christmas markets shooting, Cherif Chichat, was killed. Now, what we know has just come out from this building is 9 o'clock. Around this area, it's a heavy industrial area, residential area too. There's a football stadium here of Strasbourg. There's 3 ordinary police officers, patrol officers, who are walking past here. They saw Cherif Chichat at the door. They thought he was acting suspiciously. Were told that he looked like he was injured because he had been injured on Tuesday night after being shot in the arm as he escaped from soldiers after killing 3 people and injuring 12 others. Now, what then happened is the officers shouted to him. He turned, we're told, shot towards the officers. As we can see here, they shot back and he was killed. So after a 48-hour manhunt, in minutes the operation was over. We also heard this morning from the French Interior Minister, who said they don't believe, the French authorities, that he had a support network. What they're saying is that they had detained members of his family, 5 members, for questioning: his mother, his father, 2 brothers and a sister, and that he effectively was hiding out here somewhere, perhaps amongst rubble, perhaps amongst familiar places he knew in the past. So this long-time career criminal, who had many charges not related to terrorism, was on a list of those who were suspected of extremism in France and was being monitored. For the moment, there will be questions about that, but there is relief here, sheer relief that it's over, and some normality returning as well, because the Christmas markets are opening after being closed today. So I think the streets have been so quiet now, some kind of life continuing, the raid being over here.
Gavin Lee reporting from Strasbourg. The time is 16 minutes past 12 now. The headlines on BBC Newsroom Live. The Prime Minister warns the EU that it risks an accidental no-deal Brexit if she can't convince Parliament to back the agreement. Police in France, as you've been hearing, shoot dead the gunman who attacked Strasbourg's Christmas market on Tuesday. And a 5-week-old baby boy dies after he was attacked by 2 dogs at his home in Cambridgeshire. Time for some more sport, and back to Catherine Downs. Hi there,
Thank you, Anita. Good afternoon. For the second time in a week, Chelsea fans face allegations of offensive behaviour. First of all, 4 fans banned from their ground after allegedly racially abusing the Manchester City player Raheem Sterling. Now the club has had to condemn reports of anti-Semitic chanting during last night's Europa League game. A statement released by Chelsea said of any kind or any other kind of race-related or religious hatred is abhorrent to this club and the overwhelming majority of our fans. Any individuals that are found to have shamed the club will face the strongest possible action. Well, Matt McGeehan from the Press Association was at the game, and he says the club have had enough of this kind of behaviour.
Chelsea have a Jewish owner, Roman Abramovich. They have been very strong on anti-Semitism and discrimination of any type. And they're fed up, basically. They're a minority of their supporters are not getting the message. So Chelsea are basically telling them that they're not wanted.
Now it's the fight everyone had been hoping would happen. Anthony Joshua has confirmed he does want to fight Deontay Wilder next year. He'd already booked Wembley for the 13th of April. All that's missing is an opponent. Joshua holds the IBF, WBO and WBA belts, but the winner of this bout would make one of them the undisputed champion of the heavyweight division. After Wilder's draw with Tyson Fury earlier this month, there's been talk of a possible rematch between those two, but most boxing fans want to see either fighter face Joshua, who has said he's not interested in Fury because he isn't the champion. London and Manchester are on a short list of cities to host the ATP World Tour Finals from 2021. The end-of-season tournament for the world's top 8 male players has been held in London since 2009, but that agreement expires in 2020. Singapore, Tokyo and Turin are the other contenders, and the decision on the city will be made by March at the earliest. And former England spinner Ashley Giles looks set to replace Andrew Strauss as England's director of cricket. Strauss is stepping down as his wife is undergoing cancer treatment. Giles is finalising the contract details to take over. He used to be England's one-day coach, and he'll be taking the reins at a pretty critical time for England with a home World Cup and an Ashes tour to Australia next summer. And that's all the sport from me for now. I'll be back with more just after the 1 o'clock news at about 1:30. See you then, Anita.
Thanks, Catherine. Now, wages are still worth a third less in some parts of the country than a decade ago, according to a report by the TUC. Research by the Office for National Statistics says there was a record 32.5 million people in work in October, while earnings are rising by 3.3%. That's their fastest rate for a decade and by more than the rate of inflation. But the TUC points out that because of the way pay has lagged behind the cost of living on the whole over recent years, our real incomes are still below where they were ahead of the financial crisis. Because of that, they say workers have lost out on an average of £11,800 over the last decade in real pay. The worst affected are Londoners, who've lost out to the tune of £20,000 on average. Earlier I spoke to Stephen Clark, who's a senior economic analyst at the think tank The Resolution Foundation, which aims to improve the standard of living for low and middle income families. He told me why workers are earning less.
The context of this is that we've had a pretty disastrous decade for pay. Real wages are still below where they were before the financial crisis. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that wages are rising now, and they've risen quite strongly towards the end of this year, rising at the quickest rate in about a decade, and rising above inflation, as it says. So there is some good news, but overall it's been a pretty poor decade.
And why have some areas been worst affected by this lag, this pay lag, if you want to call it that, than others?
Well, I think there's different stories in different parts of the country. So in London, for instance, research we did earlier this year showed that the real challenge was for new starters in London and people kind of moving in and out of work. So that if you'd remained in a job in London, you'd done quite well. But if you were moving in and out of work, perhaps because of you moving in and out of unemployment, or you're starting a job for the first time, then your pay was pretty low. And in other parts of the country, there'll be different challenges, perhaps just broader economic challenges with some parts of the country. So I think it is a really local story here, and therefore that's why you get these very different figures.
Looking at the really big picture here, though, with the TUC pointing out that because of the way pay has lagged behind the cost of living on the whole, we are worse off as a country than a decade ago, and most people have expectations that in general, you know, with each generation, people will become better off.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the big picture, as I said, is a really worrying one in terms of wages. You know, inflation for many times over the past decade has been quite high, and wages have struggled to keep up. And also, as a country, productivity growth has been very slow. So as an economy, we've been growing very slowly over the past decade as well. And so I think, you know, that is all very bad news. The good news, as I said, is on wages are starting to rise. And I guess the real unknown is how much we're going to see that strength continuing into 2019, or whether other things, perhaps uncertainty around Brexit, perhaps just a downturn in the economy, or for other reasons, you know, whether that will actually mean that we kind of set back even further, or whether we can start to catch up with that ground we've lost.
Well, on the subject of catching up, do you think it is ever possible to catch up on the ground lost? You know, given the uncertainty over the economy in relation to Brexit, especially.
Well, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the kind of government's forecaster, expects us to regain that lost wage growth sometime into the 2020s. But then, you know, the future is very unknown, and lots of things could throw that off. On the other hand, you know, it could be quicker than that. We just don't know. But, you know, as I said, it has been a poor decade, and we're not going to see that unwound any immediate time soon.
Stephen Clark there from the Resolution Foundation. The Public Spending Watchdog has found that an army recruitment drive has faced significant problems, including a website that cost 3 times its budget and was 52 months late. Outsourcing giant Capita was awarded the £495 million contract for army recruitment in 2012. But the National Audit Office report says it has failed to hit soldier recruitment targets every year since. Capita admitted it had underestimated the complexity of the project, and the Army says it has put in place a plan to address the challenges. Half of UK homes could get faster broadband with a single call to their provider, according to the telecoms regulator Ofcom. New figures also show that 1 in 7 households could get a faster service for the same or even less money than they pay at the moment. Ofcom is launching a new website to help consumers find better deals. A 5-week-old baby who was attacked by 2 dogs near Peterborough last month has died. Ruben McNulty was seriously injured after the incident in Yaxley in Cambridgeshire. The family's 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers have now been destroyed, as our correspondent Jane Francis Kelly explained earlier.
Ruben was just 2 weeks old when he was attacked at his home on the 18th of November by the 2 Staffordshire Bull Terriers who were destroyed after the attack. Now, Ruben had very severe life-threatening injuries. He was taken to Peterborough City Hospital and then transferred to Addenbrooke's Hospital, where he sadly died yesterday. A 28-year-old woman and a 31-year-old man were arrested on suspicion of child neglect, but have been released pending further investigations. Ruben's parents have locally, or are believed to be, Amy Litchfield and Dan McNulty. The case has been referred to the coroner and is not being treated as suspicious.
Jane Francis Kelly. Scientists are calling for mandatory food labels that spell out the impact on the environment of everything from meat to chocolate. They say it would help us as consumers to make informed choices about how the food we eat can contribute to climate change. Our science correspondent Helen Briggs reports.
Lunch hour at a market in South London, and these customers say they'd welcome more information about environmental impacts.
I think maybe just like more advertisement on what impact it has, like sort of in your face advertisement and statistics, and you kind of look at them and you go, wow.
You have to kind of turn around the packaging and then kind of look for it. So I think it would help to kind of make it more clearer, and so we can make a more ethical decision, because sometimes it's not really our fault. It's like how they label it can really influence our choice.
I think I'd like to see corporations and big food businesses taking more responsibility for the impact that they're having on the environment.
Beef and dairy have high carbon footprints, but products like chocolate aren't far behind. And according to this scientist, if all foods had labels spelling out their environmental credentials, we'd be able to make better informed decisions.
What we eat is one of the most powerful drivers behind most of the world's major environmental issues, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss. Labels would create the information about greenhouse gas emissions, about biodiversity loss, and put that on products.
Climate labels for food are already being considered in Denmark, but European food manufacturers are sceptical, saying there's a risk of overloading customers with information. Helen Briggs, BBC News.
And if you want to explore this a bit more and find out what impact your food choices could have on the environment, you can use the interactive tool on the BBC News website. That's at bbc.co.uk/news. Let me just take you briefly to Brussels, where I want to let you know that we're expecting a news conference from the Prime Minister, Theresa May, or a statement from Theresa May on the second day of the Brussels summit. Of course, you'll know that last night the Prime Minister didn't get the sorts of concessions and legal guarantees or legal assurances that she was hoping to get to help her sell her deal, her Brexit deal, to MPs at Westminster. She was criticised for not being clear enough about what she was asking for. So that is due to happen. Of course, when it does, we will bring it to you live. Now, adverts which show a woman being unable to park a car or a man struggling to change a nappy are to be banned from next year. Under a new rule drawn up by regulators, ads mustn't include gender stereotypes which are likely to cause harm or serious offence. This would also include any depiction of girls being less academic than boys. And don't forget, you can let us know what you think. Tweet us using the hashtag NewsroomLive. All the ways to contact us are on the screen right now. And it's time now for a look at the weather forecast. We can get that with Stav Danaos. Hi, Stav.
Hi there, Anita. Thank you very much. Well, the weather after a couple of quiet days is looking pretty wild as we head on into the weekend. We've got amber warnings in force. More on that in just a moment. This afternoon it's going to be another chilly one, but largely dry with plenty of sunshine. 1 or 2 showers across eastern coastal areas, but the main focus is this next weather system pushing into the west. It'll bring outbreaks of rain, which will turn increasingly to snow across western Britain as it bumps into the cold air, because it's going to be another chilly start for Saturday. This area of low pressure, pretty vigorous system, is going to bring this area of rain, which will bring snow and ice to central northern areas, and then a spell of very strong winds later on Saturday across England and Wales. But the Met Office amber warning is now issued for snow and ice through Saturday and into Sunday for northern and central parts of the UK. So there's likely to be some disruption for this. You really have to stay tuned to the weather forecast. We start Saturday on a cold, largely dry note across eastern areas before it turns very wet for Northern Ireland, much of England and Wales. As it pushes increasingly into that cold air, we'll see areas of snow from eastern northern England into much of Scotland. 2 to 5 centimetres in the lower ground, up to 20 centimetres over the higher ground. Gradually it will turn milder from the south, but it's going to be a slow process.
Now here's the science bit.
Ready. Could a bendy phone be the future?
There really is no driver.
Oh,
feel better for that.
Click. Tomorrow at 12:30 on the BBC News Channel.
Join Simon McCoy as he brings you the top stories live.
The ball is entirely in the UK's court. We could have got our tennis correspondent to report on this.
The latest in sport.
Heaven knows how they're dealing with this on the court.
The heat or the wind? I'm not quite sure.
Well, both.
The day's weather.
It's getting colder.
And undeniable chemistry.
He's still laughing.
We have to talk to each other.
There's only one Simon.
So you're the real McCoy.
Afternoon Live with Simon McCoy, weekdays at 2 p.m. on the BBC News Channel.
Hello, good afternoon. This is BBC Newsroom Live with me, Anita McVeigh. The headlines for you. And the Prime Minister warns the EU that it risks an accidental no-deal Brexit if she can't convince Parliament to back the agreement. Police in France shoot dead the gunman who attacked Strasbourg's Christmas market on Tuesday. The market, which attracts thousands of visitors each year, has now reopened. Unions warn Britain has suffered the worst pay squeeze for centuries, with real pay still a third lower than before the financial crisis. 5-week-old baby boy dies after he was attacked by 2 dogs at his home in Cambridgeshire. NASA's Juno mission to Jupiter reveals spectacular views of the planet's polar storms. Back to our top story, and the European Council President Jean-Claude Juncker has accused Theresa May of not being clear about what her Brexit demands are. The Prime Minister met leaders in Brussels last night, but she's been told the deal isn't up for renegotiation. It's day 2 of the summit, so let's return to Brussels and my colleague Ben Brown.
Yeah, Anita, we're going to be hearing from Theresa May quite shortly. She's going to be having a news conference here in Brussels after this EU summit. We already saw her in some pretty animated discussions with Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, after he described the British position last night at his news conference as nebulous and imprecise, saying that he hadn't heard really clarity from the British Prime Minister or from the British side. So I don't think she'll be too pleased with what he had to say, but be very interesting to see what she says at that news conference. In the meantime, while we wait for the Prime Minister, let's talk to Hans Olaf Henkel, who's a German member of the European Parliament, a member of the European Conservatives and Reformist Group, and was formerly president of the German business employers group, roughly equivalent to the CBI. So thank you very much for being with us. What is your reading of the fact that the EU really haven't given the British Prime Minister anything of what she wanted at this summit?
Well, I think this, in my view, unacceptable. You know, for me, Brexit is like 2 trains running on the same track into each other. And Juncker is sort of in the locomotive of one of those trains that says, well, it's not my problem, the British caused it, so he goes on. I think it is time for responsible European politicians to really change the game right now. And while I understand that he couldn't really change the agreement, I think he could do one other thing. He could now say that if Britain decided to stay in the European Union, which, as you know, the European Court of Justice has made possible, then Europe would be willing to give Britain a special deal in certain things, like, for instance, in immigration. That, in my view, would support the Remainers in Britain, and on the other hand, it would give some of the Brexiteers a face-saving way out.
Well, that's an interesting idea, but what about all the people who voted in the referendum to leave the European Union and not stay in it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. However, let's say there are 2 things which have happened. Number one, a lot of things have become clear in Britain, which in my view, the British voters didn't know. Neither the Brexiteers nor the Remainers really knew what they would get. For instance, the deal right now is something which was not discussed during the referendum. That is one development. But also in Europe we have had a development after the referendum. Also Europe has changed. For instance, the opinion about uncontrolled immigration, which was one of the key factors in the last few weeks of the debate in Britain, also that has changed in Europe. It's not only, as you know, Hungary and Poland. It's also Belgium, and it's the Netherlands, it is Denmark, even Sweden. And by the way, even the German government has changed dramatically its refugee policy after the referendum. So Europe has also changed. So I think it is, in my view, entirely plausible that Europe recognizes that Britain, or Cameron, was right when he wanted some more autonomy over immigration, and that Europe now offers Britain something. So should this New Deal be rejected by the Parliament, we are not running into the situation.
Do you feel, do you fear, do you sense that we are perhaps heading for a no-deal Brexit? Because, frankly, we are running out of time, aren't we? You know, Theresa May's already said this isn't going to be put to a vote in the British Parliament this year. This EU summit is about to end with no agreement with the British government.
Yes, I think this is very possible. Remember my little picture of 2 trains on the same track running against each other. Even if Mrs. May is able to halt one, the other one keeps on going. So I think it is necessary that something new is being put on the table. And what I'm here presenting or recommending is an initiative which has been created by more than 2,000 people. It's called New Deal for Britain, and it is not aimed at London. Let me make that clear. We don't want to mess around in the internal debate in London. It is aimed at Brussels, because we believe that it is now for Brussels to change the game and offer Britain a new deal. By the way, there are two other reasons. One is, number one, Brussels is also responsible for Brexit. I always say that Britain joined a football club and Brussels decided to play hockey. So Britain had a good reason to be upset about Brussels. And on the other hand, what is totally ignored in Brussels is that Brexit has a highly negative effect also on the EU. When I listen to Mr. Barnier, who is the negotiator for the EU, he is very eloquent in describing the economic difficulties which Britain will face. He has not once said a word about what it means to Europe. And let's not forget, already today, Britain is the largest single customer of continental services and goods, even ahead of the United States and China. So you don't treat a potential customer like Barnier did. So my position is, folks, this is a disaster. Let's stop it. Let's come up with a new idea.
Okay.
And, well, you got it.
We got the message. We've run out of time, but great to talk to you and some very interesting thoughts there. That's Hans Olaf Henkel there, member of the European Parliament from Germany, speaking to us from Berlin. That's it from me here in Brussels for the moment. More from me in the coming hour.
Ben, thank you very much. Just a reminder, we are expecting to hear from Theresa May very soon. But earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP and a leading member of the pro-Brexit European Research Group, Marc Francois, one of those who put in a letter of no confidence against the Prime Minister. I asked him what the Conservative Party is planning to do when she comes back from Brussels.
What we're being asked to vote on, this is it. It's the withdrawal agreement, and it's a draft international treaty. If Parliament were to approve this, and then you need an Act of Parliament to ratify it because it's a treaty, that would be binding forever in international law. And it's as plain as a pikestaff that this will never get through the House of Commons, because the House of Commons is overwhelmingly against it. That's why they pulled the vote at the last minute, because they knew they couldn't win. And
those reassurances will make any difference to anyone, if not members of the ERG, then any other Conservative MPs?
I very much doubt it, because the only thing, because it's a treaty that we're dealing with, the only thing that would change the treaty is an amendment to the treaty itself. You can come up with so-called reassurances, but they're not binding in international law. They're you know, it's like a love letter. You know, it doesn't have legal effect. And everyone in the House of Commons knows this. You know, MPs, you know a bit about the law. It's their job. They're legislators after all. And everybody in the House of Commons knows that unless you amend and change the text of the treaty, anything else is pretty meaningless. And the Prime Minister's problem, and it's a problem for the Cabinet too, is the EU have said very plainly at this meeting they're not going to reopen the text of the treaty. So the Prime Minister, I'm afraid, is completely boxed in.
Hasn't this been a failure of negotiation and a failure of planning on the UK side, though, to see what an issue, what an intractable issue the backstop would be?
Yes. You know, we have negotiated poorly on this right from the word go. You know, in order to show how tough we were, we offered to give the EU £39 billion of British taxpayers' money for absolutely nothing in return. Then we got tougher. Then we agreed to go into a backstop, which once we enter it, we could never leave unless the EU allowed us to leave. It's what's often referred to in Parliament as the Hotel California backstop, because you can check out, but you can never leave.
But Marc Francois MP talking to me earlier. A quick look at the scene in Brussels. Lots of media gathered there. We think that the Prime Minister may be emerging soon to talk about her day and a bit in Brussels. It hasn't gone the way she wanted, has it? But we will be back when that happens. Meantime, as we've been hearing, adverts which show a woman being unable to park a car or a man struggling to change a nappy are to be banned from next year under a new rule drawn up by regulators. Ads mustn't include gender stereotypes which are likely to cause harm or serious offence. This would also include any depiction of girls being less academic than boys. Let's talk now to Sam Smethurst, CEO of the leading gender equality campaign group, the Fawcett Society, which in the last few days launched its own anti-gender stereotyping campaign over Christmas toys. Sam, very good to have you with us. We're not exactly in Mad Men territory, the advertising of the 1950s and 60s, are we? But would you agree that some adverts have allowed lazy stereotypes to persist?
Absolutely. We very much welcome this initiative by the ASA. We think it's really important to challenge those lazy stereotypes and to force advertisers to think about the message they're sending and what they're trying to achieve. I think so often we do it unthinkingly, and so this initiative will actually put the onus back onto advertisers and say, well, what are you trying to achieve with this stereotype? If it's going to cause harm, going to cause serious offence, then actually you shouldn't be doing it.
What's the evidence about the harm that this sort of stereotyping actually does cause?
Well, it's really quite extensive and pernicious, and actually the whole of the gender stereotyping that we experience begins from our very first moments of life. You know, we experience it from babyhood right the way through our lives until we die, and actually it limits our choices, it limits the horizons of girls in school, for example, and what they perceive to be the careers for them. It normalises aggression in boys and men, and leads to some of the kind of violence against women and girls that we see prevalent in our society, and it inhibits men in their caring roles too. So what we normalise around dads, for example, and what is acceptable as normal in the workplace. So much of the harm that we see in our society can actually be traced back to gender norms and stereotypes. So we have to start challenging it, and we have to start confronting it, because it costs society and it costs our economy hugely.
And I know the Fawcett Society would like to see those gender stereotypes being really turned around in advertising, but do you think in practice that's what will happen?
I think this initiative is a start. I don't think, you know, it's not going as far as proactively saying to advertisers you should not only not do this, you should challenge those gender stereotypes. But I think this is a really important step, because unless we all start owning responsibility for this and question our own behaviours and our own assumptions, we will never change it. And we're all living with the consequences of this in our daily lives every single day, and it costs our society and our economy a huge amount, so we have to start changing it.
And I'd love to hear a little bit about your own campaign, the Fawcett Society campaign on gender stereotyping in toys, at a time of year, of course, Christmas, when, you know, toys are everywhere.
Absolutely. We just started something very simple and say, we want to smash stereotypes. Tell us about the stereotypes you see when you're out doing your Christmas shopping. So we're asking people to tweet us images of where things are gendered for no reason. So, for example, Kinder eggs are hugely gendered, it turns out. Why? You know, it's a chocolate egg. There are so many things that when you go into the shops and you look online are just segregated by gender for no reason whatsoever, other than a marketing ploy and other than really a ruse to try and generate a demand that isn't there. And actually, when you ask kids themselves, well, you know, do you even like pink? You ask girls, do you like it? And they'll say no, but they walk down an aisle and all they can see is a sea of pink. What are we doing to our children? And actually, it's not what they want, it's not what parents want. We need to start changing it, and we all have a responsibility here. Advertisers have a responsibility, you know, the entire toy industry has a responsibility, and we really want to start confronting that and actually saying, there's not only a responsibility here, but there's an opportunity for you to do something different and turn this to a marketing advantage.
OK, Sam Smethurst, CEO of the Fawcett Society. Very good to have you with us. Just let's take a look back at Brussels. We are still waiting to remind you that we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister, Theresa May, very shortly there in Brussels after, well, not the summit that she wanted after winning that confidence vote on Wednesday night. She travelled, of course, to Brussels yesterday, but she hasn't got the sort of legal reassurances over the backstop issue, the desire, of course, to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in the event of a trade deal not being worked out between the UK and the EU post-Brexit. So she didn't get the legal reassurances she wanted. She got some reassurances from the EU27 that they would work swiftly to get to that trade deal, but certainly nothing that's going to satisfy certainly the sternest critics of her deal back home in the UK. So when Theresa May speaks, we will bring that to you. In the last few moments, some news just coming to us from the courts where a 16-year-old boy has been found guilty of murdering schoolgirl Victoria Sokolova. The teen murdered and raped the 14-year-old schoolgirl in a park in Wolverhampton earlier this year before dumping her body on a bench. The time now is just coming up to 10 to 1. Let's take a look at the headlines for you. The Prime Minister warns the EU that it risks an accidental no-deal Brexit if she can't convince Parliament to back the agreement. That is our top story today. Police in France shoot dead the gunman who attacked Strasbourg's Christmas market on Tuesday. The market, which attracts thousands of visitors each year, has now reopened. And unions warn Britain has suffered the worst pay squeeze for centuries, with real pay still a third lower than before the financial crisis. A Syrian refugee hailed as a hero for helping to save 18 people from drowning during the crossing from Turkey to Greece has told the BBC of her despair after being arrested and put in prison 3 years later. Sara Mardini was detained on the island of Lesbos in August and faces charges including people smuggling and spying, all of which she denies. She's been speaking to our correspondent Richard Galpin in one of her first interviews since being released on bail last week.
After more than 3 months in prison in Greece, Sara Mardini is back amongst college friends here in Berlin, at least for now. This her adopted home, where she was granted asylum. She told me the prospect of being put on trial in Greece in the coming months hangs over her heavily, and how during the past few months in prison she despaired of ever getting out.
Think about the outside, think about everybody. And yeah, I said to Sam, would I be able to see them again? So imagine with this situation, I'm just thinking about everything and I end up not having any sleep. The night was my worst friend.
Just 2 years ago, she and her sister Yusra were hailed as heroes here in Germany, receiving awards for helping save lives. Like many Syrians fleeing the civil war, they'd made the perilous crossing from Turkey to Greece, but only just. When their overcrowded boat started taking on water, the two sisters, both elite swimmers, jumped in and helped pull it to Lesbos, swimming for more than 3 hours through big waves and strong winds.
I was looking to everybody and seeing that we might die, and I knew if I want to make it, I'm going to make it. All the people on the boat, we believed that we're going to make it and we wanted to make it.
But earlier this year, when Sara returned to Lesbos as a volunteer for an NGO helping refugees and migrants, she was arrested